Hi everyone, and thank you for attending again this new webinar series on COVID-19 vaccination in Southeast Asia. Today we will discuss vaccination and employment law in Laos. My name is Marion Carles and I am the Regional Legal Advisor and Head of DFDL's Employment Practice Group, and I will have the pleasure to host this series of webinars on COVID-19. For those who are not familiar with DFDL, we are a law firm based in Southeast Asia and we specialize in emerging markets. We are present in 9 countries and employ over 150 advisors and more than 300 staff. We have a team dedicated to labor and employment across our various offices, to ensure that our clients receive constant, seamless, and appropriate legal assistance when employment labor issues arise. So we have actually a good audience attending our webinar today, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during this webinar. If you do not have the chance to answer these questions, we encourage you to follow up with your question by email at our email address. You can find our contact information on our website at dfdl.com. So joining us today on the program is Standré Bezuidenhout, who is a Senior Legal Advisor at DFDL Laos. Welcome to the program, Standré. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Marion. Thanks for the introduction. I'm very well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So I think now we will kick off. So Standré, before we start, discussing the core of our program, could you perhaps give us a little bit of update on, how is the situation in Laos right now? I understand there is a lockdown. Did the vaccination campaign started in Laos yet or not?
Marion, yes. So we currently in a quite strict lockdown, which has recently been extended until the 20th of May. It's quite a considerable outbreak in the capital of Vientiane, breaking 700 confirmed cases. So relative to the size of the capital and the past confirmed cases from 2020, the current outbreak could be seen as quite significant. From a vaccination campaign perspective, the government has launched a campaign in February this year. It was initially limited to frontline and at-risk workers, but has since been widened to the general public. The number of doses given to date aligns with the government's initial target of 22% vaccination by the end of 2021. Which target was yesterday increased by the government task force to 50% by year end. The vaccinations have primarily been sourced through bilateral donations, with some being obtained as part of the COVAX program. As we're aware of some of the larger employers in Laos having arranged or facilitated for on-site workforce vaccinations.
Thank you. So it's progressing, it's encouraging. I hope it will help the current lockdown and the current situation soon. So a question that we actually get a lot, and I'm sure you got it from your clients in Laos, is now that the vaccination campaign started, can an employer require its employees to be vaccinated?
Marion, as far as we're aware, no guidance has been released or published from the government specifically on the rights of an employer and employees related to vaccinations. Lacking specific guidelines or instructions, we are limited to the prevailing laws, most notably the labor law, the law on healthcare, and the law on vaccinations. Under these laws, an employer does not have the right to unilaterally require its employees to be vaccinated. A possible exception could be if this unilateral right was already provided for in the employment agreement or the internal regulations of the employer, which regulations have been approved by the Labour Management Authority. Interestingly, the law on vaccinations appear to empower the government to mandate vaccinations where there's a spread of any disease which has a risk of wide infection. But this right has, of course, not yet been triggered.
But it's interesting what you say in terms of, whether there are any provisions on the employment contract, because this is something that we will probably see in the future, and this is something that we might, keep in mind when we are advising our clients and drafting their template employment contract. Thank you very much. So another question that is interesting is, for workplaces where there exist, trade unions or other form of collective representation, is an employer obliged to consult with them prior to implementing employee vaccination? So again, I understand this question is a little bit ahead of time because now, the vaccination is organized at the governmental level, but if things would have to evolve in the future, is that something that we should consider?
Yes, again, sorry, Marion, the same principle would apply. So again, no regulatory guidance as yet, but so unless an employee vaccination program is already agreed or contained in the employer's internal regulations, the imposition of a workplace-wide vaccination program represents a change to the employment terms and conditions and has to be agreed by each employee as required under the labour law, the civil code, as well as specific COVID-related regulations issued by the Ministry of Labour and Social Welfare in 2020.
So the answer is no. Right now, there is no obligation to consult any trade union or other form of collective representation, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Unless it's provided in the internal labour rules, but it's quite unlikely that they do so. So, okay, thank you very much. And actually moving on to another, area of law which is related to, this COVID-19 vaccination campaign and everything is its implication in terms of data protection law. So I don't know if Laos has any has any dedicated data protection law, but if this is the case, is the information concerning an employee's vaccination considered as health information or sensitive data? Is this concept exist under the law?
Yes, Laos do have the law on protection of electronic data, which and it relates to information relating to an employee's vaccination, which would fall under the category of health data, and it's protected under this law. Regrettably, the law appears to contain a contradiction. The law itself contains a blanket prohibition on the collection, use and disclosure of health records or data, whereas in contrast, the underlying guidelines published under this law include health records in the definition of specific data, and specific data can be collected, processed and disclosed by employers if consent is obtained from the data owner, being the employee. So arguably, under the more specific and recent guidelines, an employer can collect and process an employee's health records or data if they receive permission to do so from the employee. But given the contradiction, we are in the process of seeking confirmation from the authorities on which provision would prevail.
And have we been able to obtain this confirmation, or it's still uncertain?
It would be in the form of a verbal confirmation from the relevant ministry, and at this stage, because the government offices are closed, it might likely only happen after lockdown. Okay,
so I presume our recommendation will be in this case to prevent any, as you say, issue in the law. So it will be, I presume, to obtain the employee's consent before collecting and processing any personal data, I presume.
That's right, Marion. If with written consent from the employee, a lot of the risk would be mitigated.
And consent will be given in writing, I presume.
For sure.
Consent is always more difficult to prove. So, okay, thank you very much. So moving on to another question that raises a lot of interest is the possibility for employers to terminate employees who refuse to be vaccinated. So again, we might be a little bit ahead of time, but this is definitely a question I think that will need to be considered in the future.
Yes, as to the question of whether, so an employer would always be entitled to terminate an employee, but if the termination ground is as a result of an employee's refusal to get vaccinated, the employee will have a strong argument that the termination is for no sufficient reason and unjustified, and it will then trigger severance calculated at a higher threshold of 15% of the last salary, multiplied by the number of months worked by the employee. Of course, a counter argument could be if the employer has a set vaccination program in its internal regulations, and the internal regulations has been approved by the Labour Management Authority. In this case, the employee will contractually be compelled to accept the vaccination. If not, it will be a breach of contract and justified termination with no severance being payable. The employer could also put forward the argument that it is merely complying with its statutory obligation to ensure a safe and healthy work environment. But given the lack of government guidelines and any judicial precedent, it's difficult to confirm what position or interpretation the regulator or the People's Court would take in the event of a dispute. This is also one of the points that we're trying to engage with authorities, given that it's such a novel issue.
Yeah, because it was actually my subsidiary question. What is the likelihood, that the Lao authorities accept, such a provision, such a requirement in the internal labor rules? Because what I know a little bit the process for registering the internal labor rules in Laos, it can take a lot of time, and they are in general quite, thorough on how they review the provisions and everything. So, yeah, I presume
They do tend to scrutinize the internal regulations when it's submitted for approval. So you do have the added benefit of if it is approved, then in principle the Labour Management Authority would have agreed to any, for example, vaccination program of the employer. But again, lacking judicial precedent, it's very hard for us to assess what the outcome would be if ever there was a dispute and it went to for court proceedings.
And another question that comes to my mind, and I don't know, maybe you can clarify, is there any threshold to, be obliged to have internal labor rules, or is it mandatory for all companies?
It's a mandatory obligation for all employers in Laos. These internal regulations need to be accepted by a majority of the workforce, or accepted by, a majority of the workforce or the workers' representatives need to accept it, and then in addition it needs to be approved by the Labour Management Authority. And in the event, in the case of INGOs, the internal regulations need to be approved with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
I see. So even if you only employ 2 employees, you still need to have internal labor rules, right?
That's right. Yes, Marion.
Wow. It's really stringent for the companies. I didn't know that. Okay, thank you very much. So now I think we can move on to the last question. And this is, can an employer require employees who cannot or will not agree to vaccination to refrain from coming to the workplace? And this is a very interesting question, because on the one hand, I understand that the vaccination should be free and based on each individual consent. But on the other hand, I imagine that the employer still has the obligation to ensure a healthy and safe workplace. So how can the employer deal with these 2 obligations?
Marion, so in principle, yes, you can force the employee to not come to work, but the employer then runs the risk of the action being seen as a form of discrimination against unvaccinated employees. The labour law is quite clear, it clearly prohibits employers from directly or indirectly discriminating against employees. But as you mentioned, employers also have the general obligation under the labour law to ensure a healthy and safe workplace, and to adopt appropriate measures to ensure the health and safety of its employees. Likewise, under the labour law, employees have the dual obligation to adhere to these measures to ensure a health and safe work environment. And in fact, these obligations are also repeated in the law on vaccinations, where all citizens have the obligation to take care of their health, the health of their families and communities, and to cooperate and participate in any administering of vaccines. An employer's decision to require its employees to be vaccinated during an ongoing pandemic arguably would be regarded as an appropriate measure to ensure workplace health and safety. An employer would need to weigh the discrimination element against its general obligations under the labour law and the law on vaccinations to ensure a healthy and safe workplace.
No, but yeah, and I'm sure indeed the authorities and the court will be probably more flexible in these unprecedented times in general. So yeah, this is something that we can also take into consideration. So thank you very much, Standré. So let me now have a look at the audience questions. And there is one that I think may be interesting. So yeah, so are there any measures or steps an employer can take or implement to mitigate the risk of a dispute arising if it proceeds to force vaccination or implement a vaccination program?
So, Marion, I think any measures or steps will depend on the individual circumstances of each employer, as well as its resources and what it has in place in its internal regulations and employment contract. I think the employer should ensure that it's in a position to, in the event of a dispute, explain to the Labour Management Authority or the People's Court why unvaccinated employees would pose a direct threat to its business, other employees and clients or customers, the nature or severity of the potential harm, and the likelihood of this potential harm being triggered. You would need to justify the restriction on the employee's right, being the right to choose not to get vaccinated, and the clear discrimination, and consider all alternative options. Does the discrimination cause undue hardship to a particular employee's belief or health? Can the employee be offered an alternative workplace within the employer's business? Or would the provision of protective clothing under the protocols recommended by the WHO work and mitigate the risk of infection? I think all of these questions and options need to be considered for each individual employee against the prevailing circumstances. I also think that communication here is key. If an employer does decide to treat unvaccinated employees differently, it needs to be in a position to explain to the employees why any distancing or discrimination measures are being implemented, being as comprehensive as possible in order to avoid a dispute. From an evidentiary perspective, record in writing all principles and steps taken and circulate these for feedback to the employees. You can also consider arranging a presentation to the employees by an independent registered health practitioner on the benefits of vaccination. And then I think lastly, from a liability perspective, just bear in mind that if an employer compels or strongly recommends vaccination to its employees and the vaccination results in adverse health reactions to an employee, that employee or their dependents who suffer damage, whether it's in the form of financial damage, bodily harm, or even death as a result of the vaccination, may have a claim against the employer under the Civil Codes tort action. So with this in mind, any vaccination should be preceded by a consent and waiver form where the employee waives its right to claim against the employer for any adverse consequences as a result of the vaccination. I think collectively,
this is a very good point. Yeah.
Yes, collectively these measures can mitigate the risk, but of course it will still depend on the individual circumstances of each employer and its resources and what it has in place in its employment agreement and internal regulations.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, and unfortunately, these waivers need to be put in place by employers, you know, whether they are part of the vaccination program or whether they encourage or whether they help, you know, for instance, I mean, some employers in other jurisdictions have helped, you know, employees by, you know, putting at their disposal buses and means of transport to go to the vaccination centers. If this is the case, in this, we always encourage employers to, you know, put in place, you know, specific documentation by which they could not be held responsible for, you know, the employee's choice to take the vaccine. I think it, and you're right, I mean, it's really, really important. And communication is also key. I totally agree with you. Thank you so much. So maybe just a last question, since we still have a few minutes left. And this is not really related to vaccination, but a question that we get a lot is, okay, if one of my employees gets infected, not necessarily at the workplace, but, you know, if he has, you know, COVID-19, is the time of absence will be treated as a sick leave or any other leave? Standré, you're on mute.
Sorry. There were a bunch of regulations published last year by the Ministry of Labour and Social Welfare in 2020, which we believe is still in place because it hasn't been repealed or replaced. So under these regulations, it provides that an employer will be required to continue to pay the monthly salary to the employee during any period of self-isolation or sick leave as a result of COVID infection. So in effect, an employer will be compelled to remunerate any employee who has contracted COVID and has to stay home for sick leave in the ordinary course.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Standré, for all this information. I think it was very helpful. I myself learned a lot of things. So yeah, thank you for that. If, you know, the audience has any questions regarding this webinar, feel free to contact me or Standré. You can find easily our contact information on our website. This session has been recorded and will be available shortly on our website and on social media. If you enjoy this program, I encourage you to connect next Tuesday at the same time for the Philippines session, where our legal expert will discuss COVID-19 vaccination in the Philippines. So thank you again, Standré. That concludes our webinar for today, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Standré.